Good morning, everybody. My name is Nubia Revilla. I'm going to talk about how to create and use rubrics. This is the book that I've read, and it's written by Susan Brookhart. Focusing rubrics on learning and not on task is the most important concept of this book, Susan Brookhart. This statement really summarizes the idea of the book and the conception of the author and how to handle and use rubric for formative assessment and grade. The author emphasized that the most important focus is the student learnings, and I think we all agree with her on that. The book teach us how to create rubric for formative assessment and grading, and has the purpose of helping teachers to use and design rubric correctly and focusing on the student learning and not only in the task we assign. This book outlines the difference between various kind of rubrics. It also explains when to use each type of rubric and highlight examples from all grade levels and assorted content areas. I would strongly suggest you all read this book if you want to prepare or create or use rubrics more frequently because this is an important guide. I'm going to try to summarize the most important aspect of it, but I would say that it's basic to have this book on your desk and, use it as a consultant guide. The author also explained to us in the book some misconception about rubrics and some bad habits that we all have and make important remark about the difference between rubric and other assessments such as checklist or rating scale and when those alternatives are also useful. She also mentioned how to use formative assessment rubric for formative assessment and grading and and for the use of report card as well. So, what are rubrics and why are they so important? To start with, I would like you to make a self-reflection just like I did. What is your own idea of rubric and how do we use them? In my experience, I think I have used rubrics more for grading purposes. I have the good intention to explain students what is expected from them in a task, but I would say that could be more like a good checklist more than a rubric that will guide their work to their learning targets. So I think I have had the bad habit of not using the rubric with as a general guide to help me teach and to help the student learn. So according to the definition of the author, rubric is a coherent set of criteria for a student work that include description of level of performance quality on the criteria. There are two major aspects emphasized in here. One is the coherent set of criteria and descriptions of level of performance of these criteria. The main purpose of the rubric is to assess performances, but not to judge it, only to focus on student learning. Its main function is to allow the teacher to match a certain specific performance to a description rather than immediately judge it. So, showing, developing, and giving evidence of learning, that's the job of a rubric. And they are important because they can guide our planning, center our teaching goals, and student learning objective. In other words, it helps teacher help and student, it helps teacher teach and student learn. There are several classification of rubric, but according to the number of criteria, we can say that rubric can be analytic or holistic. Analytic, in the analytic type, each criteria, dimension, trait is evaluated separate. In the holistic type, all criteria dimensions are evaluated simultaneously. In this table, you can see some of the advantages and disadvantages. I'm not going to repeat it. You can go through them. But basically, the author recommends more the analytic, general analytic type. And you're going to see next what is the general rubric definition. The analytic gives a better diagnostic information to teacher and better formative feedback to student. That's basically the main feature here. The main point about criteria is that they should be about learning outcome. Remember, not aspect of the task itself. If we talk about rubric that are general versus task specific, is very self-explanatory. The general one is the description of word that gives characteristics that apply to a whole family of tasks, not only to one. And the task specific, of course, describe the work of one specific content or task. The main point about description of level of performances is that they should be description, remember, not evaluative statements. In this table also you can see some of the advantages and disadvantages, but the general is more recommended, and because you can share this with the student, and you can reuse them in several tasks, not only one. And also it's support learning by helping the students see the bigger picture of it. Uh, the task specific is more for grading, and scoring is easier. Require less time to achieve, reliability. There are some common misconceptions about rubric, and we can classify it in three main one. One is confused learning and outcome with task. When you confuse the learning goal to be assessed with the task to use to assess it, I mean, that is one of the biggest problems of rubrics. Okay, rubrics are not direction for assignment. And this is a common mistake that we all teachers do. And that we focus on the progress, on the product, not in the learning goal. Another big misconception is that we use rubrics. We confuse it with the requirement for the assignment, and what we do is that we list the element for the task. For example, we ask for fact, graphic, and neatness, grammar, and this is more like a checklist for a task, more than a description of a criteria about the learning target. So at the end, we assess the compliance of the task, but not the learning. We also confuse rubric with evaluative rating scale when we have a criteria that is well identified, but we give numerical scale for each, such as, for example, excellent, good, fair, poor, which translate to ABCD, of course. And rubrics are not evaluative scale. They have to have description of the scale itself, and so that students know where to, place themselves in their learning and how to achieve it. So these three basic misconceptions are like bad habit that at some point we all have done, and it's because we don't focus on the main thing, that is the learning goal of the learning objective that we have for each lesson. Um, for example, if we want a student, to learn to describe something, and to work on writing descriptions, so we cannot use a rubric to define, only the task of describing a house. And so if we only focus on, how the description of the house is, if it's clear, if it's well done, etc., but we don't focus on the fact that we want a student to learn how to describe something. So we have to be very, very specific on what we want the student to learn. Rubrics, like the whole purpose of this book is to show how rubrics are useful for formative assessment. And there are two basic concepts that are important here. And one is that rubric help us, to share student learning with them, and and use it for evaluative purposes as well, and for grading, and for also for further learning to guide them in in the next step of learning. So learning targets, it's important to describe them in the rubric and do it in such a way that student will learn, you know, and understand the language. Not in a language that is good for teacher, but it's good for a student. We have to make a student make sure that they understand the instruction about the formative and the summative assessment, the performances, and how do they interpret the goal, the learning goal is very important. What are they supposed to learn, to develop, and what evidence they are supposed to give of their learning. So it's good to have them discuss it in pairs or in the whole class, to make questions, to even write it in their own words so that we know that they understand it. It's good to dedicate time to work with the student and to understand the rubrics before we start the to work on the lesson or on a specific task as well. Um, it's good to clarify the ideas and the concept, and if possible we can even give them the rubric and give them some samples so that they can grade it and they can see how to apply the concept of the rubric. So sharing learning with students is one very important goal of the rubric related to formative assessment. And also another very important one is that we can obtain feedback, and a student can obtain also feedback for their self-assessment. Formative assessment is about learning. A student can monitor their own work with the rubric, work with peers, or have peer feedback, and have teacher feedback. So this is not a work that we're gonna do just once, when we give that, but all through the lesson we have to have a student work with the rubric as well. The author gives some example on how to, or suggestion how to use different type of rubric, or either writing them or selecting them in the book, which is important to go through. And you can go through in this little explanation as well, when to use general analytic rubric and what are they good for, when to use task specific rubric, when are they good, when to use proficiency based rubric that is basically good for standard based grading. So according to your own school situation, you can use this type of suggestion that the author gives. Also, she talked about what are not rubric. For example, checklist and rating scale, they are not rubric because they lack the description of performance quality. They have criteria, but they don't have performances linked to it. So they are good, and she's not saying that we don't have to use it. They are good in addition to the rubric. It's a good list of features that tell the student to identify which of them are present or absent in the work. Okay, so it's a good practice, but it's not a rubric. um, she also gives some sample how to use the rubric for grading. Basically, it's good to identify the set of individual grade you need to summarize, but you have to put them in the same scale. We're not comparing apple to oranges. It's not good. We have to compare apple to apple. So you have to know the scale that your school uses, and if it's by subject or by standard, and then you have to put all the rubric information, or grade, or feedback in the same scale. That's the easiest thing to do, and then you can use the rubric for grading as well. Some of the good example of rubric is the 6+1 that we use in writing, that is very well known. You can go through it in the appendix of this book, and it's very self-explanatory, very widely used, and it has become a standard way to look at student writing. And I suggest that you all go through it. So in conclusion, rubric are or can be used to describe, develop, and support learning. It guides teacher and student through the process of learning. To be a rubric, remember, must comply two characteristics: description of criteria and performance. Rubrics are often confused by